Interest channel, where we dive deep into real estate, economic empowerment, and legacy building for the next generation of developers, investors, and community leaders. Today's guest is a legend in the making right now, man. He's been doing this for some time. We're joined by Mr. Kenneth M. Morrison, the principal and managing member of Lemor Development Group, a Harlem-based family-founded real estate firm that has restored and developed over 2,200 homes across New York City. His work stands as the intersection of faith, vision, and impact. He started young, getting into the family brokerage as a sophomore at Howard University, and has since become a trusted name in affordable housing, legacy development, and mentorship. If you're serious about building wealth and building up your community, this episode is for you. Kenneth, welcome to Better Living Interest Channel. Thank you for coming.
Oh, indeed, Paul. Thank you. I appreciate you having me. And folks need to recognize the leadership that you're provided in this space. We need not only to hear from folks who have been in the business for 20, 30, 40 years, but I think that that message received from our younger generation, like I call you the young soldiers that are out there. We need you young soldiers out there, like getting the word out to the masses. So I appreciate you doing this, and I appreciate you having me on. And I look forward to the conversation.
Oh man, thank you. You've been a wealth of knowledge and a mentor to me, and I've been very vocal about that publicly and privately. So, to have you here on the show to talk about the work that you're doing, I think it's going to be beneficial not only for me and inspiring for me as always, but definitely for our audience here who are just starting out in real estate and or are already doing the workings in real estate development, because real estate development definitely has a lot of different nuances that you're not just going to be able to learn from an academic approach. You're going to have to be in it to learn that work. So yeah, thank you. So first question that we have here is talking about when you stepped into real estate while still in college, even stepping away from school to build your career. What gave you the courage and clarity at such a young age to pursue this?
So let me clarify that, and I'm going to have to give you probably some of the history on how I got into the business and how we ended up in business with my dad as a second generation real estate professional. So when I was in high school, graduating high school, my dad was very entrepreneurial. He had an income tax business, he had a real estate brokerage, but he also worked full time for the transit authority. The year I graduated from high school was also the same year he retired from the transit authority and decided to just go into his real estate business, income tax business full time. He had an office on, I believe, 160th Street off of St. Nicholas Avenue. And again, I had gone away to Howard University, but after 2 years at Howard, I came back because my grades were not that good, right? So I decided to stay home for a year or so to figure it out. So while I was home, my dad said to me, "So, well, while you're figuring it out, why don't you get your real estate salesperson's license and why don't you learn how to do income taxes?" So I went to H&R Block. They had a school that I took their class and learned how to do income taxes. Started working with him while he did the taxes during the seasonal period. But I also went to school and got my salesperson's license and started working for my dad. And that was probably like around 1988, right? Late 80s when that happened. And I sustained myself by apartment rentals. There weren't many sales going on. When they talk about redlining was for real, right? My market was the Harlem market, a lot of brownstones, SROs, and the major commercial banks that are doing lending now in this community were not at that time. There were just a handful of lenders who were providing mortgages for these kind of properties at that time. So sales were far and few between. So in the meantime, and during that time, the only folks who were really buying these brownstones were investors. So in the meantime, we thought about, well, what are ways we can extend or expand the business? My dad had owned a couple of properties. He self-managed. So we thought, well, maybe let's go into the third-party property management business. So we literally just put together some letters. Back then you had a typewriter, right? There weren't computers back then. Typed up a letter, sent it out to the owners in the community and said, hey, we're this company here. We're based in Harlem. We were up in Washington Heights at the time, but we're Harlem based, Washington Heights based, and we can manage your properties. And a few people got back to us. So we picked up a couple of contracts for brownstones, a couple of small apartment building owners, and we started managing properties. We also became what's called 7A administrators, which in a very short version, a short definition, it works like a receiver where a court appoints us, a housing court would appoint us as a 7A administrator to take over management of a building that was not receiving services. So tenants were not having receiving heat, a lot of complaints, a lot of violations. The court, and they could petition the housing court, and housing court can literally tell the owner, you no longer can manage your property. We're going to appoint a 7A administrator until you fix the building up. So we became 7A administrators. And there's a point why I'm telling you that. We did that, became 7A administrators, but what that did was it gave us experience dealing with stressed properties, right? So we were managing properties now that had hundreds, if not thousands, of violations, buildings that had boilers that weren't working, roofs were leaking, problems throughout the building. But we kind of cut our teeth working with these distressed properties. In the early 1990s, the city of New York at that time was by far the largest landlord, but they were by far, admittedly, the worst landlord. They have properties in all the communities where we are, right? The communities where we typically are, the South Bronxes of the world, West Bronx of the world, Southwest Bronx of the world, the Harlems, the Washington Heights, the Bed-Stuys, the Brownsville, so on and so forth. So the administration at that time said, we want to create an RFP where we want to hire locally based property managers, right? Not developers. They wanted property managers that had experience with distressed properties. And we want them to be they have to either work in the neighborhoods where these properties are, or have to live in the neighborhoods where these properties are. So my dad and I saw the RFQ at that time, and we said, wow, this looks like it fits us to a T. So we submitted an RFP or an RFQ, submitted an application, and we were called. We were selected for the very first round of a program called the NEP program, the Neighborhood Entrepreneurs Program. We were awarded 4 buildings, 3 were vacant, 1 was occupied with 51 apartments, and it just happened to be the occupied building happened to be a building that we were the property managers of some years ago. And it was interesting because my dad said, oh, it'd be interesting. Wouldn't it be lovely to own this building? And come full circle, we end up being awarded this building. However, we weren't developers, right? So we didn't really have any experience working with architects. We didn't have any experience working with contractors. So the city of New York paired us with a not-for-profit, and that not-for-profit kind of like, I don't want to say held our hand, but they worked with us side by side as we worked with financial institutions. They were financing the project with low-income housing tax credits. I was brand new to this space. I had no idea what a low-income housing tax credit was, but they suggested to me, this is how we're going to finance this project. So as we're doing it, we were learning the business. So we ended up working with a syndicator who got our tax credits. We ended up working with a commercial bank where we got a construction loan. And then the city of New York had permanent financing for the permanent debt. And we worked with 2 different contractors, and we rehabbed, was a total of 4 buildings, 105 apartments. And we were pretty successful at it. And the city of New York liked us. The financial institution who loaned us the money, they liked us also because we were a father and son team. We were based in Harlem. So from that point on, from that 105 units, we ended up in further rounds of the program, right? There were maybe up to around 6 rounds of this program, but we participated in maybe 4 or 5 of those rounds because of the success in that first round. So I kind of that was a long way of answering your question. How did I get to business right out of college? But it was really because I came home from college and decided, like, I did come back and I did attend some classes here locally, but I wasn't sure what I was going to do. So I kind of really fell into this business. I have to be honest, it wasn't intentional. I didn't come into this business or get into real estate thinking like I'm going to develop properties. It was an opportunity that my dad presented to me, say, hey, while you're figuring it out, get your real estate license. And that's how it grew from there.
No, that's amazing. Like, that's really the precipice of generational wealth, right?
Right.
You have elder in the family who believes in the younger generation and imparts some knowledge. The younger generation has now some interest in the work, and then they work as a collective. It's not just everyone's working in silos, they're working as a collective. And then boom, next thing Lemor development, we're going to speak about this
Yeah,
further,
we'll get into that.
but,
Yep.
you have been able to grow. So I love that, man. It's so
Yeah, and
inspiring.
just one other piece I left out of that story. I was very entrepreneurial. So even when I did go to Howard University, my major at that time was computer-based information systems. So, computer science when you in the 80s was a huge was new then, and then right, it was a huge major back then. But I envisioned it. I was like, oh yeah, I'll work in corporate America for 5 years, and I'm gonna open up my own software business. Like I went in, I was 17 years old, thinking I'm gonna own my own business because I saw what my dad was doing with his businesses, right? So even though I wasn't thinking I was gonna go into the real estate business, I just knew I was going to be an entrepreneur. And I have that spirit in my genes. I've owned a restaurant. I've owned a bar. Hey, I was a party pro. Who was it? Everyone was a party promoter. We were promoting parties. I owned a barbershop, right? Don't cut here, right? But but it's in my blood. I saw my dad do it, so I just knew that I had to be an entrepreneur, no matter where that was. And I'm thinking about another line of business that I'm probably going to open up in the next few months. Talking to my wife about that. So it's in my blood. No matter where I am in this stage with real estate, I'm always going to open up a business and do something on the entrepreneurial side. So I just wanted to throw that entrepreneurial piece in there also.
Yeah, no, please do. And I also will highlight in this discussion that your father was working, a job,
Right.
and
Right.
he was able to use his job as his initial investor. Right. So taking that money that he was working, and then investing that money back into his dreams, his passions, into creating, additional streams of income. It started to
That's right.
compound on itself and it started to build. And then you guys found a niche and something that you cared about, you liked, and it just worked out for you. So yeah,
That's right.
this is great. This is great stuff.
That's right. That's right.
And hopefully to pass on to the next generation too, right? So, yeah.
But I mean, that's part of it, right? So my son, I have a 17-year-old son, and he's more into he talks about business and the music industry, but tangentially, he's going to own real estate, right? At some point. And I need to make sure that even if he doesn't go into real estate, come into my business, he has to know real estate, right? He just has to know how to operate, how these buildings operate, how to get financing, how to manage, just because it's part of the family business, right? I'm a second generation. And again, he may not decide to move into this business, but he has to know all the aspects of this business because he's going to have properties at some point, right? So, these properties pass on to him.
Yep. You're gonna live somewhere. So
That's right. That's
he
right.
should be in the position of ownership for sure, if you can and you're willing to.
That's right.
Uh,
Most definitely.
so following up with that, with talk again, emphasizing on your family and the generational wealth aspect of this business. Lemor Development Group is deeply rooted in family and has been able to grow up in the business influence field with your leadership style. So what has that been for you, creating who you are as a leader, who you are as a CEO, and how have you been able to make your own mark within the company?
So, a lot of it came from watching my dad, right? His temperament, the way people liked him. I watched how he treated people. I listened to how he spoke to people, and I let that transfer to me. Right. So obviously when you're a business owner, sometimes you have to make rough decisions. You have to make decisions that may not other folks may not like, but it doesn't mean you have to be nasty about it, right? There's a way of communicating. And I think I've learned his communication skills on how to pass on information to folks, whether it's good, bad, or indifferent. And I think that's part of like my personality, and it helps me in my business, right? So some folks may not necessarily like the directness of it because sometimes you have to be direct. But one of the things I think is valuable, one of my values is being honest and truthful, right? So honesty is I think very valuable in business. A lot of folks in business are not honest. We have a reputation in the development industry and just in real estate of not being an honest person or not just being an honest industry, that we're just only out for the dollars. But for me, it's a little bit different, right? So I develop in Harlem, born and raised in the Bronx, but I develop in Harlem. I live in Harlem. That's right. And I'm a proud Bronxite, but I'm a proud Harlemite also. And I feel like whenever I walk these streets, I shouldn't have to worry about running into a tenant or running into someone who's had a negative experience with me because something went wrong. right? Even if we may have had some kind of issue, rent wasn't paid or there was an issue in your apartment, but I'm always going to treat you the same way. I'm always going to treat you with respect and I expect to be treated the same way. So I try and just be truthful, honest, but respectful with people. And I think, I try to pass it on to my son. You just don't want to be, some people out here are a-holes, right? And don't be that person, right? You can still make a good living. You could be respected. You could be valued, but you need to be respectful of those who are around you. I look at my residents, they're my tenants, but they are my customers, right? I don't have or make a living without my customers, without my residents. So I have to treat them like that, right? So yeah. So, I hopefully that kind of answers the question for you.
Yeah, for sure. As you're speaking, a few things that are coming to mind. There's this image of Obama when he was in office as the president during his term, and he's like dapping up one of the janitors that are working there.
That's
And
right.
it's like, that's a constant reminder that you could be at the highest level. Like this man is the president of the United States of America, the world superpower, at that time.
That's right.
And he's the most important, he's the most influential person in the world.
That's right.
And he's still treating someone who, is cleaning toilets. And that's not a bad thing. That's a job. That's an honorable job, and if you're doing your job, you do your job at your highest level. And he still respects the person no matter what the position is. And I believe, I have a personal belief that a leader is close enough to relate to, yet I had enough to follow. And as you're talking and you're explaining yourself, those are leadership qualities that shouldn't be taken lightly. And it also reflects on how well you've been able to succeed in your business and do the work. So, yeah, again, kudos to you. But plus,
That's
you're a
right.
traveling man too, right? So you
Well, that's right. So we as traveling men, we both are traveling men. We understand that we are all on the same level at all times, right? So, and that's part of being a traveling man. And I've been a traveling man for wow, maybe 34 years. I didn't realize it was that many. I just did the math. So,
Wow. I think I broke
over
12
30
years.
years. Yeah.
You over
12
30
years.
years.
Yeah.
I just broke 12. So,
Yeah.
shout out to Prince Hall, Grand Lodge Estate of New York as well. Shout out
Exactly.
to those good brothers
Exactly.
over there. That's real
That's right.
estate development too, but that'll be on another episode. So with talking more about the business itself, you something to highlight is that you have developed and or restored over 2,200 units across New York City's 5 boroughs. Many of them have been in the what we would deem as the affordable housing description. So how do you approach projects that must be financially viable and balancing out with the mission driven purpose of your business?
Yeah. So, so we are obviously a for-profit organization, right? So, obviously we need to work on projects that are going to provide revenue for us, right? But at the same time, I have a firm belief that all New Yorkers, or just all folks in the United States, because we are now venturing outside of New York, but I have a firm belief that all New Yorkers deserve and should receive quality above standard housing, right? But at the same time, when you do that for folks who are of moderate incomes, the rents aren't that high, right? So how do you manage that? So part of what we do is in the affordable housing space. Obviously, we work with a lot of low-income housing tax credits. We work with various subsidies from the city of New York and from the state. And now we're also working with the New York City Housing Authority on a couple of projects. So that's how we have to do a blend of a combination of new construction and preservation deals, right? So for it to make sense, just like any other business, you have to sometimes diversify your business model. So new construction projects, yes, developer fees can be nice, but the runway for a new construction project can take multiple years, right? You could go 4, 5, 6, 7 years waiting to get a new construction development going, and then you don't get paid until tenants are in or units are sold, right? So you add another year or two to that aspect, right? So in the meantime, what do you do? So we do property management, but at the same time, we also recognize the need to do preservation deals. And in a city like New York, where there are just thousands of buildings all built in the early 1900s, that means there are plenty of opportunities to do preservation. rehab units. Sometimes you do rehab with tenants in place. But a lot of times, the folks who live in these units can only afford up to a certain amount of dollars. And then we also don't want folks to be rent burdened, meaning that they pay more than 30% of their income towards housing, right? So we do these affordable housing developments either with Section 8, HAP contracts, subsidies from the city of New York, or low-income housing tax credits. And we kind of blend the both, right? New construction and preservation. And that's how we do both. Some of our developments are not strictly 100% affordable housing. Some have moderate income units in them. So that's also how you kind of cover the expenses. You might have a 30% of the units might be market rate or close to market or maybe moderate rate, while 70% would be affordable, have some kind of regulatory agreement on it. So that's kind of how you blend. And then what we've also recognized, because the market in New York City has become so tight, and managing properties in New York has become really difficult with all the regulatory agreements that they and regulations they put on in New York City, and increases every year. It makes managing properties that more expensive, particularly low income properties where the revenues don't cover all these new regulations. So we started recognizing that we need to go outside of the New York market also. So we started doing some deals. We like the Atlanta market. So my business partner is from Georgia. He went to school in Georgia. So, it was a natural, and I had a lot of family and friends in Georgia. So we looked at the Atlanta market. So we did a deal in 2018. It's a kind of value add. We bought an apartment complex. It was 120 units, did some rehab, and then sold it. Then we picked up another one that we're managing right now, going through that same process in the Atlanta market. And we're starting to look at some other opportunities. I'm looking at there's a potential opportunity for a deal in Augusta, Georgia, that we're looking at. Someone sent me something in the city of Atlanta. So we're starting to diversify the type of deals we do also, right? Those deals won't necessarily be strictly affordable deals. Those deals are going to be more on a value add investor deal, right? So we recognize the need that we also need to do investor deals to kind of make sure there's income coming in, because some of these other projects, especially the preservation deals now, don't cash flow like they used to. The new construction deals still have these long windows before, these long runways before you get paid. So we also recognize the need that we need to just kind of get into that investment space also, where incomes are coming in on a regular basis. You have to, but again, the cost to get in those kind of developments and projects are high, right? So we have to find that niche space where we can get in, where we can afford to get in, and then still generate some income for the company.
Hey, well, shameless plug. Let me know if you're interested in the Southern Ontario, Canada
Okay.
market. Yeah, Niagara Falls, Canada. It's booming. That's like their equivalent to Las Vegas for Canada. So there's a
So I
lot.
have I have one rule for investment for myself. I need to be able to take one plane ride there. I don't want to take any connecting flights.
Oh no, one
I
plane
need to.
ride. You'll be there.
I
You'll
need to.
be you'll be there shorter than a whole LP album. You'll literally
Right,
be
right,
landing
right.
right there. 45 minutes max from New York City to Niagara Falls.
Yeah, that's important for me, because I think about my Atlanta deal. When I would go to Atlanta, I would get on the flight in the morning and I'd be home that night. Go
Mhm.
right to LaGuardia, and I could jump on a 6, 7 o'clock flight and be home by dinner time, right? So I was looking at a deal in, I think, Daytona, Florida, and I was like, wait, I had to take 2 planes to get here. Like, I'm not doing that. And then I was looking at something in Tennessee, but the town it was in, you had to take connecting flights. I was like, it doesn't work for me, right? If I'm going to be, for me, it needs to be in a place, one couple hour plane ride, and I'm back, right? Major cities. But obviously the opportunities, right? The better opportunities are going to be in those secondary and tertiary markets that you may not be able to get to. But at least for me right now, like, time is important, right? So I need to know that I can jump on a plane, get there. If there's a problem with the situation, I need to know I can do that fairly quickly and then get back home.
Yeah, 40 minutes, and you get a 30% off discount with the USD Canadian conversion. We'll talk.
Listen, yeah, we need to talk offline.
Yes, we'll definitely talk about that. So yes, you highlighted that you work on different types of deals. You're doing affordable housing, you're doing moderate housing, or what they call workforce, uh,
Yep.
development, and also market rate, right? So we have these three tiers. You also have highlighted that you have worked with public agencies as well,
Yes.
public authorities, and you also mentioned not-for-profits. So with that, what advice would you give to new developers looking to build trust and transaction in this space with those partners?
So two responses. So this development business is a relationship-based business, right? So unlike sales or apartment rentals, where you want to get to the closing, right? That's the transaction part. You have your closing and then you move on. I mean, you may stay in contact with that client to get referrals, but for all intents and purposes, that deal is over and you can move on to the next. To me, real estate development is not necessarily like that. And the reason I say that is one of the things that my company does, we do a lot of joint ventures. We do a lot of JVs, right? We're a small shop. We have 6, 7 folks here. I don't have a bunch of analysts here. I don't have a bunch of market analysts here. I don't have a whole bunch of project supervisors to manage my projects. Project managers to manage my projects. So we always JV, right? So we look for companies that can kind of complement what we do. And doing that, these are long-term relationships, right? Development deals, unless it's for sale and you might at the end of the sale, you sell, but we don't do for sale, right? For the most part. And we're starting to do, and I'll talk about the for sale deal with project we're about to work on. But for the most part, we do rentals, all right? And we do long-term holds. These are long-term relationships. So you have to really establish relationships with folks. They have to get to know you. I know it sounds really basic, but people like to do business with people they like, right? So folks have to get to know you. It's like a marriage, right? You meet somebody. Think about this, if you meet someone and you're like, oh man, I like this person. You don't get married the next day, right? You establish a relationship, you get to know the person, and then, if the relationship, if it builds that way, then you make it into a long-term situation. Same thing with business. Same thing with these deals here. You might run into someone and they don't have the same character that you have, or they don't have the same values that you have, and they may not be the business partner for you, or it might not be the deal that you want to do, or it may not be the faith-based institution you want to do a long-term deal with. May not be the owner you want to do that with. So I think it's real important to establish relationships as you're in this development space. The second part to that answer is reputation. So it's extremely important to maintain a very good reputation, because your reputation would take you a long way. You're going to find that in this space, we call this space a small world, right? There's a small world of developers, financiers, the folks you do business at one particular bank is going to end up at another bank you end up doing business with. But there's also going to be folks you're not going to encounter. It's going to be folks who are going to be new to the industry. But if they've heard of you before, they know about the projects you can do, that goes a long way, right? So it's like having goodwill, right? You're providing in advance goodwill on your company name, on who you are. So always maintain a good reputation. But to me, that means being diligent with the deals you do and being truthful, right? Don't be the person that sells goods. Don't oversell, that underperform, right? Be the person that performs what you say you can perform, and your reputation will grow behind it. And then, there will be folks who will like, I've heard of you. Let's do business together." You'll start getting calls because of it, because folks will say, I've seen your deal, or I heard about your deal. I saw something on the real deal, or I saw an article about you. Can we talk about a deal? So that's important. And the other thing that I do is, and I'm starting to do a little bit more of it, is, and I did not like to do it before, but speaking, right? Going out and just being at different organizations and being on panels, which I didn't really like to do it first, but I recognize now that I do it. First, I like to give out information, right? I like to discuss, especially amongst our people. But it also has benefits, right? I'll get a call like, "Hey, Ken, you on this panel? Can we look at this deal?" I did a panel up in Westchester County, and I had a couple of folks who I would never even think to do business with called me up. I mean, none of it turned into a real deal yet, but it was like, "Hey, I have this opportunity." This guy was like, "I own these properties. I need to develop it. Can you help me?" And so that also happened, right? So I know I said two things, but the third thing is just letting folks know, spreading the message on who you are, building your brand by letting folks know who you are. I'm not like a social media savvy person, so I'm not the guy on Instagram. I'm not I mean, I do have a LinkedIn account, but my thing is just getting up in front of people and just saying, "Hey, this is who I am. This is what I do. It's a couple of projects I've done." So, and I let my reputation also speak for me, and then I use that to build and create relationships.
Yeah, that's pivotal. Being a person of your word, man or woman of your word, getting the
Right.
work done, being transparent and accountable, and self advocacy. Promoting yourself, doing the good works that you're doing. So it's working. I can definitely say that. You are definitely working out here, brother, and you have so much more room to grow. So I'd love
I
to see it.
appreciate it.
Yes,
Appreciate it.
yes. And, going back to your upbringing and your roots with Harlem, and I know you also mentioned the Bronx. Shout out to the BX, you know what I mean?
That's right. That's right. Right. Let me throw that in there. Let me throw the BX. Let me throw the X up in there.
Make sure we get that on the real.
That's
Um,
right.
as someone deeply rooted in those places, what's your approach to ensuring that development uplifts rather than displace? And specifically, what we're talking about is gentrification, right? So,
Yep.
you as a developer, you're building these new projects, but you also have this other aspect of it of how does this impact the community? How do you balance that?
So yeah, I'm glad you asked me that question. I'm going to divert a little bit. Like I said, born and raised in the Bronx, born in the West Farms area, but raised in the Pelham Parkway area. But I've always romanticized about Harlem, and let me tell you the reason why I say it like that. My family, my parents' lineages are from the South, right? Both from South Carolina, from different towns. But both sets of my grandparents had moved to Harlem at some point. And both sets of my mother and my father's side of the family, when folks came from South Carolina, my grandparents' homes was sometimes a place where my uncles and aunts, when they first came from the South, they stayed there, right? So I spent a lot of time in Harlem as a youth because I had so much family there, and there was family all spread out through Harlem. So I would spend a lot of time just coming to visit family in Harlem as a youth and also as a teenager. So I also thought about the history of Harlem, right? So I used to always listen to my dad and his friends tell their stories about the Harlem in the 50s and the 60s when they were young men. And my mother too, she was a young woman and hear these stories. But then also I coming up in the 70s, as a kid in the 70s, I saw Harlem ravaged by the heroin era, right? That was late 60s, early 70s is when heroin kind of transformed what Harlem used to be for our parents. And then in the 80s, I was a teenager in the 80s, and the crack era came, right? So I saw what that did to Harlem, right? And the killings and the guys with the cars. And I'm gonna tell you a little sidebar. When I got into real estate, I'm gonna get back to the question, but one of the things that disappointed me, there was a lot of young men who were making a lot of money in these streets. And I met this guy, right? Let's call him an OG. And I said, hey man, he knew I was in real estate, and we got to start a relationship. And I said, hey man, this guy's always buying cars, have all this money. I always hear stories about these guys walking into car dealerships and dropping $50,000 and walking out with cars. I said, man, I can show these guys how to get apartment buildings. And then, back then you could buy an apartment building in the Bronx 3 times the rent roll, $170,000. Apartment buildings were less than $200,000. I was like, man, I'll show them. I actually had an attorney lined up. I had the attorney lined up, right? And he knew what these folks did, but he was like, don't worry about it. I can set them up. The property is being other families' names. I don't even think LLCs and stuff were created yet, but I had it all set up. And I set up a meeting on a Saturday, and the guy was like, oh, I'm gonna get about 10 people to come to your office. And he said, well, what do you want out of it? I said, well, my goal is I'm a broker. All I want is a broker's fee. And I'm a property manager. And I was like, I don't even know if I really want to manage the properties, but I may want to manage a property or two, but I'm going to get paid from being the broker. And I'll say, hey, if they let me rent the apartments, I'll get broker's fees when I rent the apartments. That's how I'm going to benefit. Not one person came.
Mm.
We set up this meeting. Not one person. And it just like kind of disappointed me about what's happening in our community. Like we've lost our way. At least some of the older generation, like when my father's friends were out there in the streets, they bought buildings, they bought properties, they own buildings, they own businesses. But my generation, that was all lost on them. So this is the Harlem that I'm seeing, but like I said, I've always romanticized about Harlem. I think about the history of Harlem, right? Malcolm X at one point lived in Harlem, right? Think about all the cultural activities that happened in Harlem. Langston Hughes lived in Harlem. Maya Angelou, even though she wasn't from Harlem, she bought a brownstone in Harlem. There was so many. Claude McKay lived in Harlem. There was so much cultural things that were happening in our community that was lost.
Madam
And
C.J.
as a real
Walker as
Madam
well.
C.J. Walker. I mean, it was just so many things that were happening in the community where so many beautiful things. Matter of fact, the building I own right now, when Billie Holiday moved to New York, she lived in the building for a short period of time, like maybe 6 months, right? But I mean, that's the history of Harlem. And I'm growing up romanticizing about it. Matter of fact, when I think I was in junior high school, I had to do a school report. I did it on the Harlem Renaissance, right? So I'm all Harlem, right? I'm all about Harlem, and not knowing that one day I'm going to end up doing development in Harlem. But when I end up doing development in Harlem, I'm thinking about the history of Harlem on top of what Harlem can and should be without gentrifying Harlem, right? So affordable housing is obviously the space I was in. So affordable housing, doesn't necessarily gentrify the community. But I also recognize that you have to have moderate and high income folks in the community also, right? A community just doesn't thrive off of just one low income level, right? That's my opinion, right? It doesn't operate that way. I feel like you need to see professionals, right? You not only do you need to see working class folks, but you need to see doctors. You need to see a lawyer. You need to see lawyers. You need to see professionals walking the street, living in your buildings, living next door to you. I think that's important also. So when we were marketing our units, even though you kind of have to use a lottery, but we were also hoping and looking to get those professionals in these buildings also, right? So and that's why I say everything when we develop, it needed to be high quality because as we're doing high quality, you get high quality folks, but at the same time, you have people who respect where they live, right? And I think that's important. So as I think about developing in Harlem, part of it is like maintaining that cultural integrity that Harlem was and making sure it stays here in Harlem. And especially now, as a resident, I'm raising my son here, I own my business here, I own a home here, own property here. I feel like I have a super duper stake in this community. And that stake also includes seeing us here, but also seeing us as owners here and seeing businesses that look like us here. Right. So, and when I think about some of my small commercial spaces that I have, because I have some buildings that have these small spaces, 600 square feet, 1,000 square feet, the vast majority of my business owners are folks from this community or come from this community. So I think that's important to keep the integrity woven into what we do here.
No, that's 100%. Like, man, that's as real as it gets.
Yeah.
That's as real as it gets. I mean, you hear these stories oftentimes about people saying, there was so much money that was being made. That my parents' generation, growing up young in the 80s and in the 90s, and how people were making all of this, cash flow from the streets. But, these people are dying and they repping these blocks, but they don't own the block. You
Don't
know what I
own them.
mean? Your mama's renting, but you're not taking that money and you're not investing it into your community and making your community better. And it'll transform the quality of life. And for you to have that vision and insight and say, listen, I've been blessed with this opportunity to work with my family and do this work in this industry. It's a legal industry and it's a profitable industry
That's right.
and it's a proven industry.
That's right.
90% of the world's millionaires and billionaires generate have generated their wealth directly or indirectly from real estate.
Or if they don't, and I always tell folks, when you think about the history, right, the JP Morgans of the world, the Carnegies, all the folks who we call the barons, industry barons, or corporate barons from the 1800s, 1700s, no matter where they made their money, oil, Standard Oil, Rockefeller, so on and so forth. Even if they didn't make their money in real estate, they parked their money in real estate, right? Those generational, so those families like the Rockefellers and so on, the Carnegies, have parked their real estate in trusts that benefit their families forever, right? They put it in a situation where, especially when you put it in a trust, it can't be lost in divorce because you don't own it, right? But you get the benefits of it. And that's another piece that, matter of fact, I was just having this conversation with my class the other day, and we also had the conversation with UDC, which we'll probably talk about a little bit later. But we talked about how when you're transacting business, whether you're in this industry or not, you're obviously you should own properties in an LLC, but speak to your attorney, for that and your CPA. But at the same time, you need to put your real estate in trust, right? So your trust you'll be protected, right? It's harder to penetrate a trust, but at the same time, it doesn't get counted towards your estate when you pass on. We all will pass on at some point, right? So your family will not have to pay estate taxes on that asset, right? So I think about my I was telling that was at an event, and I said this, and everyone kind of chuckled, but it's the truth. You know, I have a 17-year-old son. Someday, the portfolio that my wife and I own, he's going to end up owning. He's the only child, so it's all going to go to him. But I imagine someday he's going to get married, and what happens if he gets divorced? All the stuff that my father and I worked for are going to go to some other family because he had a divorce. So I'm in the process of making sure that my assets my income streams, the cash flows that are going to go to him, everything is going to go to a trust. Nothing's going to come to him directly because I need to make sure it's protected and it gets passed on for his generation and the next generation and so on and so forth. But I'm also want to make sure to teach him that this is what you have to do. I didn't learn any of this stuff as a youngster, right? This was stuff I learned because I was in this space and I heard other folks talk about it. And some folks assumed that I knew and I didn't. And I had to learn it the hard way. And I was just talking to a friend of mine the other day who's around the same age as me. And he was like, man, I didn't learn any of the stuff about banking and what have you until, just a few years ago. Right. So we need to make sure that our children know not only about trust, but just banking in general and how to set yourself up to get a line of credit, how to set yourself up to buy properties. We need to make sure this is what we're doing for our youth, for our children, because it's extremely important when you think about the level of assets that are owned by us as a community compared to our white counterparts. It's a minuscule, small percentage of us that have assets because we don't own homes. And a lot of times when we own homes, we have second mortgages on them. There's no equity in them, right? So we have to teach our youth from the very beginning how to use your assets to get more and more assets. No matter
And
what industry you're in, you can make your money wherever. I'm not suggesting everyone goes into real estate. I'm not saying everyone needs to be an investor. Make your money where you make your money, but park it in real estate.
amen. Amen. Love that.
Yeah.
And I like the fact that you're always constantly dropping jewels, dropping knowledge, sharing that. And you mentioned that you're also a professor, right? So now you went going back into your history. You left college, came back to the city, was working with your dad. Your dad inspired you to look into this industry. You started working in this industry and you had completed your eventually over time, right? You started to complete these projects and develop yourself as an established entrepreneur. But you went back to school to finish your degree and
Right.
got your BS in entrepreneurship after already being, established. What people are trying to do when they go into school is to get into the game and essentially work for someone. You were already a
Right.
boss, and you said, "No, I'm gonna go back and finish this." What was that experience like, and how did that add to you as a toolkit of being a leader?
So let me first start off by saying I'm not a professor. Right. So
Okay.
the class I teach is through an organization through NAREB. However, I do, and I guess we're going to talk about that a little bit later, but I do
Yep.
plan on sending my resume and my CV to a couple of schools. I've already put it out there that I do want to teach on the collegiate level or on the real estate side. So that's something. So maybe down the road, you can call me a professor, but but right now the class I teach is through an organization, right? So
Listen,
I'm not a
in my mind, I have to say this: if you are at, especially at your level, 2,200 plus units doing new construction, mixed use, you have a honorary degree as a real estate developer. You are a PhD in my mind. So
I appreciate that. I
that's
appreciate
gotta
that.
put that on the record.
That's right. So when I came back, I did go to school. I did go to Hunter, but even that time, that's when my dad and I were really getting involved with the development. So I didn't finish it. I didn't finish the degree at Hunter. And to be honest with you, I went to an online school and got my bachelor's degree, right? So because I had the time, that was the only way I was able to get the degree. I was like, I have to get at a minimum get a bachelor's degree, right? Oh, and not because I needed, like you said, I didn't need it for a job. I wasn't sending my resume to anyone to look for a job, but just for myself, right? I had the opportunity. I was at Howard University. I've always regretted not finishing my degree there. I ended up doing so much business with Howard University graduates. I'm like, wow, like I should have been part of that legacy, right? So part of it was like, at a minimum, get your degree. So I did that, but I did go to grad school, right? So I did receive a master's in real estate from Fordham University. Now that was impactful because one, I that was some of it was during COVID, but some of it was in person. But I was always the oldest person in the class. So we always had to introduce ourselves. And they was like, "Oh, wow, you're already in the space." But what I learned is there was a lot I didn't know, even though I've been in this space, right? 'Cause I don't do every aspect of the business, right? I don't do underwriting, right? So that was really I was a challenge, but that was new for me when I had to do the underwriting, right? Some marketing I don't do, right? Corporate investing I don't do. So I learned a lot, right? Because like I said, there was a lot that I didn't know. So it was impactful for that. but it also gave me the opportunity to recognize there were some things I do know, right? So it was good in that sense because I would talk to professors and, we would realize like, oh man, you do have some experience. You do understand the markets, especially around affordable housing, 'cause that's all I've been doing. So that was a positive aspect from it. After graduating, I ended up being invited to join the Fordham Real Estate Investment Committee. So that was a benefit, right? So now, I'm on this board serving and helping to provide curriculum for the real estate program at Fordham University. So that's a benefit. Sometimes they invite me to come and speak at various events. So that's a benefit. Matter of fact, I mentioned the event in Westchester County. It was through Fordham University, how I ended up getting invited to speak, but I was on a panel with two mayors, right? So those are the kind of benefits I get. So I'm glad I went back and did that. So, but it was important for me, I'm another person. I couldn't tell my son how important an education is and me not complete it, especially when I had the opportunity to. It'd be one thing if I didn't have the opportunity, but I had the opportunity to. So I can't tell my son how important it is. Like he's 17, he's applying to colleges now, about to apply to colleges, but I can't impress on him how important it is, and I didn't do it, right? So I wanted to make sure I did that. My wife she has an MBA. Like I want him to know, like you come from a household where education is important. All my nieces are graduates, or as a matter of fact, all have graduate degrees. Like I'm showing them, like this is the new baseline, right? This is the minimum that when you have children and you have a family, at a minimum, this is where they need to be. So that was important. So that's why the education part was important for me. That was strictly for me.
Man, I wish I had you in my class. Especially now, I'm pursuing this CCIM training,
Right,
and
right. Congrats on
whoa,
that. Yep.
thank you. Yeah, I finished 103 down to the last core class 104, and every time I'm in those classes, man, it feels like a fire hydrant is just open, and I'm just drinking out of it. Hey,
Good.
crazy.
That's excellent. That's excellent.
So my one of my brothers, one of my Mason brothers, he tells me all the time, if your brain is not hurting in class, you're not learning. So
I like that. I like that. I like that.
so it's definitely hurting. I come back sore.
That's good. That's good. That's great. That's great.
Yeah, and it's good that you had that balance. I tend to speak that academic is great. You know, having a master's degree, I did learn a lot of what should be done in the field. Um, I also believe there's an and the and is you also got to learn how it's being implemented in the field. What is the reality of these things and how to navigate that? And for you, you had that unique experience of being out there and knowing what's the real, and then being able to understand what is the potential of what could happen and how it could be and should be, and
But let me
merging
tell
that
you what.
together.
That's true. But let me throw one other piece in there why I think education is important, particularly for those who want to get into this real estate space or who want to get into this development space. Those relationships begin on these college campuses. And I'll tell you what I mean. There are associates of mine who do what I do. They do affordable housing, they do development, they're real estate investors. But the one benefit they had that I didn't have was they were able to raise dollars really quick. And they were able to raise dollars because they had relationships with friends of theirs, of college graduates who went and worked in investment banks, right? They had their roommate worked at Goldman Sachs, right? Their frat brother worked at Morgan Stanley, right? These are relationships that you gain on these college campuses. And I tell every time I get in front of some kids, well, I shouldn't say kids, but youth who are on their way to college, that are in college, I always tell them, stay close to those finance majors, right? Because your first resources for when you do your first deal, it's going to be those guys. There's going to be those friends, those ladies or guys or girls, right? But those who are going into that investment banking space, that's where your investment dollars come from. So it's create those relationships. So those of you who are listening, and if you're in school, you're about to go to school, and even though your career track or your school track may not be finance or it may not be real estate, but you think you might want to get in this investment space and you need to raise dollars, you need to be close to those folks because that's where those investment dollars come from.
Yeah.
So that's an important aspect of it.
Yeah, your network is your net worth.
It's your net worth. That's right. Your network is your net worth. And to me, it starts on college campuses. I'm not saying it's the end all the be all, right? You're right. You don't have to. College is not for everyone. But if you are going to be there, take full advantage. That's definitely the case.
100%. My wife, she's also a master's graduate. She's actually from Harlem, East Side, Barrio,
Okay.
specifically, and
Yep.
she would tell her students for her program up in Niagara, she would say, if you leave here with just a college degree, then you fail.
That's right.
You have to leave here with relationships, strong relationships, because that's what's gonna really what you're paying for and how it's
That's
gonna
right.
propel you. So to hear that coming from you, definitely just an affirmation of that. So
Yeah,
and
and one of the things I assessed was, what did I lack? Like what? Because I had associates who came in and they grew their businesses really quick. Even though what I had was I had a portfolio, but what I never had was the ability to go out and get dollars. I've never had the ability to go out and get money, and they did, and they were able to grow their portfolios a whole lot quicker because of it.
that's very interesting.
Yeah.
Definitely interesting. Speaking of the work that you do and relationships, you've mentored countless emerging professionals, myself included.
Right.
What are the top three values for you that you try to emphasize to instill in the next generation of developers?
Yeah. So we talked about this, but I can't get away from honesty. Right. I think that's a trait that's missing in this world, but I value it highly. Other people value it. So, being honest on what your skill set is, being honest on what you can do, I think is a value that you need to have. The other is diligence, right? I need you to be thorough, right? I need to know that when I give you a task, you are going to handle it from beginning to end, that you're a critical thinker, right? That you're going to consider the what ifs. If the answer, if you don't see the answer right away, but then you're going to dig and find that answer, right? So diligence is the second, and number three is probably back to related to honesty, being pragmatic, like knowing what your strengths are, knowing what your weaknesses are. But when you're pragmatic, then because like I said, I do a lot of JVs, then like, you know what? This is where my weakness is, and let me go get someone that makes sure, let me hire a consultant, or let me just find this out. Being pragmatic on who you are, like I said, don't overpromise and underdeliver. That's the worst thing you can do. Do the opposite, right? Underpromise and overdeliver. But that to me, those are the three traits that I look for in folks that I think will take you a long way. Right? You can learn this business, right? I don't necessarily need you to know everything about this business. You have to know something, right? You may have to know finance. You know how to be a project manager. You may know construction. But what I'm saying is, I can teach you. You can be taught the other aspects of this business. But if you have those qualities, then I know that when you learn these aspects of the business, you're going to do well.
Character.
That's right.
Character means a lot in business. It
It
go
really does.
and
It
you
really
you
does.
could tell, you hear the stories too. People be like, oh, they bad business or they do bad business,
That's right.
and that'll stop a deal, and
That's right.
or stop any traction to you. So yeah, I appreciate that. I received that.
Yep.
And
Indeed. Indeed.
in your position too, right? Like, so you have this development company. It's a second generation development company. You're managing these properties. You're very active at Fordham University. You're also active with the United Developers Council, UDC. And that's how we got introduced, was
That's
the
right.
work that you do at UDC. Can you speak about your position being the national president of UDC and advocating for equity and access for Black and minority developers?
Without a doubt. So UDC stands for the United Developers Council, and we are one of the affiliates. I believe there are 10 or 11 affiliates in NAREB, the National Association of Real Estate Brokers, which are the Black real estate professionals throughout the United States. So the United Developers Council was formed in the early 1970s, but we are the development arm for NAREB, and our goal and our mission, it comes right from our mission statement, is to be the learning and teaching arm for real estate development for our members. NAREB members are called realtists, right? NAR are called realtors, but for NAREB, we are called realtists. So we are the teaching arm for our realtists. So we have very active programs with UDC. We do training courses. Matter of fact, we have some classes coming up now called Get Off the Bench. We're looking for those real estate professionals who want to move into fix and flips, because we feel like fix and flips are the precursor to real estate development. So we have a class for that. We did a real estate basics class last year. Yep, it was in 2024. It was a 6-part series over, I think we did over once every couple of weeks. But we taught various aspects of real estate development, right? I did the intro to real estate development. Then we had an attorney come on and talk about what entities you need to create when you create your entities, and how to work with not-for-profits, and how to operate and navigate through operation agreements and PSAs and joint venture agreement. And then we had someone gave us a case study on a development. So that's what we do at UDC. We also have a monthly call called UDC Inspirations, and we just had it this past Tuesday. And this past Tuesday's inspiration was actually an interactive class. We had a sister out of Atlanta who does financing, but she showed the members, she talked about how to do debt coverage ratio financing, right? So it's a concept that a lot of folks are not familiar with, but it's a way to get into investment properties when you're doing your fix and flip. So she discussed that on that class on Tuesday. But we have everyone from title companies to developers. We had Ben from your market. Ben did a low income housing tax credit seminar for us once. We had legal. We talk about all different aspects of the real estate development space. But the whole idea is we actually look for practitioners who are NAREB members. Some of them are not necessarily NAREB members, but we look for practitioners, and we want our listeners to just hear some language, maybe a couple of words, or hear a concept, hear an idea, and say, yes, I can do this. Let me move into my development. Let me move into development, or let me move into my fix and flip. And the reason, and we call it inspirations, when I would go to NAREB conferences, I would have many folks come up to me, hey, Ken, I own this land in Tennessee. I have 20 acres in Georgia. I have this property. I own some of the gentleman I used to always run into. I own this apartment building in Jersey, but I want to develop it, but I just don't know what to do next. Or some knew what to do next, but they were a little afraid, right, to take that next step. So the idea between inspirations is for you not to hear from me, right? Because I'm coming from 30,000 feet in the air, right? I want you to hear from someone on the ground who can tell you, like, oh yeah, I was in the place where you were, but this is the step I took, and then I was successful with that. So we've been running UDC Inspirations for the last 3 years. So, and we have a panel. We have a panel coming up. So the national conference for NAREB is coming up the week after next. It's going to be in Los Angeles, but we're going to have UDC is going to have a panel. It's going to be four. I'm one of the panelists, but we're going to have 4 panelists who are going to talk about multifamily. We're going to talk about single family home development. We're going to talk about finance. So that's pretty much what UDC does. We're going to have a booth there. We're going to be talking about joining UDC. And to be a member of UDC, you have to be a realtist, right? So you have to belong to NAREB. So those of you who are listening, if you're not a member, if you're not a realtist, you want to join UDC, we ask you to become a realtor first. But the dues to join UDC are just $50. And those funds go to run our website to cover our expenses for that. But what we do is we bombard you with information. Right. We want to be the provider of resources. They're not necessarily financial resources, but we want to give you resources, information to use in your development business. And then one other piece is now as outside of UDC, NAREB also has the Developers Academy, which is now in our second year. Paul was a star graduate of the first cohort, but the first cohort had, I believe, 50 students. This second year, there are now 220 students. There are 9 cohorts all throughout the United States. So I happen to be the teacher for cohort or region number 2, which includes New York and New Jersey. So we had our final class, actually 2 days ago was our final class, but I'm also one of the instructors for Developers Academy, and we're going to continue with that also. And then one last thing, we also, as a UDC, as an affiliate of NAREB, we also participate in other NAREB activities. So there's going to be the Black Housing Summit at Dillard University, HBCU, in New Orleans in November. And I want to go down. I want to do a class, the Intro to Real Estate Development to Dillard College students. So that's that's the activities that's happening with UDC and NAREB.
Wow, you're traveling and you're getting the word out
Yes,
there, brother. You moving, you
that's
on the
right.
move. This
That's
is
right.
this is
That's right.
great. And me as a former graduate of the NAREB Academy, I can further attest to it. Like, it was great. It was a great opportunity. I wouldn't have been able to literally present my development project to the Secretary of HUD
Right.
without the backing of NAREB. And shout out to Madam President, Dr. Courtney Johnson Rose, for having that insight and putting that together. And I love how, UDC complements the Developers Academy, and the Developers Academy complements UDC. Everybody's working in unison to really prepare everyone with the knowledge and the resources. May not be financially directly, but it is an indirect, like you alluded to earlier with your network, right? To be in these rooms, to get connected and to talk to people. And I think that's definitely a good way for us to address a lot of the systematic barriers that developers of color have in this country, is, getting access to those rooms and getting
So
your
let
projects
me
out.
just add just one other piece, right? So there was a study in 2023 by an organization called Grove Impact, and they did a study on the real estate development industry. And I always like to cite this report. So they did a count of the number of Black and Latino real estate developers in the United States, not just New York, not the East Coast, the United States. And I guess they surveyed thousands of companies. I forget the number. They found that the Black and Latino development representation in the development industry was less than 1%. Not even 1% of the real estate developers in this country were Black and Latino. Less than one. It was only like 0.54%. I mean, it was just a little bit more than a half point. So the idea behind the Developers Academy, the idea behind UDC is we need to raise those numbers, right? We need to make sure that we have the tools to make sure we're doing development. But the other thing is to make sure we're counted, right? 'Cause I feel like there might have been a few more out there that may not have been counted, but we're not counted. So we have to make sure they know who we are. So the idea behind the Developers Academy, the idea behind a UDC is to make sure that our members are in these communities or in our communities doing development. So it's no longer just 1%. We need to get those numbers way above just 1% of the industry from just 2 years ago. Right. And like I said, I always cite that because it was so striking when I read that report. It was so striking to me. And then I had other information in there also about income and so on and so forth. But the number that stuck with me was we're less than 1%. And you think about when you think about the municipalities where development is happening, particularly the communities we live in, right? So I'm in New York City, you're in Buffalo. A lot of times we're in these cities where development is happening, right? We have this older housing stock in our communities, and outsiders are coming in doing the development, and and these urban centers, and we're not participating in it. All right, and we see the workers coming doing the work, and the workers are not people from the community, right? Because we don't own it. We're not doing the development. So it's important for us to be part of that ecosystem of development. The other piece to it is you think about how money travels outside of our community. I remember I did a review on this, and I reviewed the various races of how dollars were coming to certain neighborhoods and how quickly you would leave. And of course, the Black community, the dollars left like within probably a minute, right? Compared to others where they stayed for 7 days and 6 days and so on and so forth. And a lot of it has to do when we talked about a little bit earlier, we just don't own the block, right? We don't own the buildings. We don't own the company doing the businesses. I mean, doing the business. We don't own the businesses in these buildings. So that's why it's important for me to make sure the folks in my spaces look like it's important that developers who look like me are the ones doing the development and owning the buildings in our own communities, because that's how we kind of change that cycle, right? Economic development has to happen with these opportunities because there's a lot of money transferring hands when you're doing these development deals, right? You're paying a contract, you're paying the title company, you're paying an attorney. There's a lot of money being cycled, but none of it stays in the community.
Yeah, 100%. And I appreciate you for being. I have this analogy that I learned from my wife. She says, mirrors and doors, right? So mirrors are reflections. We look like one another. I can see myself. It means a lot to me to know that, when I had met with you and spoke with you, that you actually lived in the same building that my
That's
mom,
right.
lives in the Bronx. So
That's right.
for some time, so it's like, oh wait, I'm actually, part of this less than 1% in the country, and there's someone else who was part of this less than 1% in the country that actually lived in the same building that I lived in. So, the days and the moments where I feel bad, of course, I always put my prayers and my faith in God and my family to support me. And I
Right.
also, have that reference and I say, well, Ken is doing it at a high level. You know what I mean? So if he could do it, I know I can do it too.
Right.
So that means a lot. And I know that for our viewers out there, that also can be a reference for them too.
That's right.
I do have a question too, because you are doing it at a high level in real estate and you've been doing it for, a few decades now. How do you hold city, municipalities, states, government accountable, even federal, right? Because you're doing affordable housing, so there's some form of HUD dollars being involved. But how do you hold the governments accountable and also private capital to make these projects come to fruition, specifically for developers of color to be at the forefront of it?
So, no, extremely good question. Development in general, but especially affordable housing development, is very political. Like you just have to know that going in, like the dollars that come in for affordable housing, particularly if you're talking about low-income housing tax credits, that's coming from a federal mandate, right? Federal law created back in I think 1986 or whenever that period was. Subsidies that come from either your state or your city or your county, very politically driven where those dollars, those resources are going, right? So you have to be active in that space, and your activity can play different roles. You can use typically what I would say is at a minimum, you need to at least be supporting the people to support the business that you do,
Mhm.
right? And I mean financial, right? And it also means you have to, give them access to your property sometimes, right? They have to know who you are. And then those who don't support you, you need to make sure that they aren't around as right? Whatever that means, right? I mean, like, if there's someone who's better suited to legislate for you, that's who you support. But a lot of it is just they have to know who you are. You have to be in their faces. And that's especially part of it, especially when you're doing affordable housing. Right. Again, they just need to know who you are. Sometimes, I've had to call on a local legislator to advocate for me because I was having an issue with whomever. And they're like, "Oh, sure, I'll be more than happy to help." But part of it is those relationships, right? But yeah, you have to hold them accountable. There are trade organizations that I belong to where we and I, just I was in the group, I was in a meeting last night with a high level official because of an organization that I belong to, and we had FaceTime with this elected official. Part of it is just being part of these trade organizations that do that. There are PACs that you can join. You can invest in. Those are some of the ways you can be impactful dealing with politicians. But you have to be in their faces, right? They have to know who you are. But it's always better to be in a group. So I always find that through the trade organizations that I belong to, I look to see who are advocates on the political side, and I just pick and choose. Like this is the organization I want to be a part of. Some of it also when you sit on boards of not for profits or trade organizations. Well, I mentioned the trade organization, but sometimes sitting on the board of a not for profit kind of gets you in those legislative spaces also, right? So that's part of it, right? You just have to be in the room. You have to be in the space. When it comes to those organizations or those private institutions, that's a little bit different, right? Because they're not, you can't vote them out, right? Your money can't move them away from, you can't support another CEO to take over that CEO space. There is more relationship driven. I've come to find that there are some organizations that are more apt to do business with organizations like mine or black owned businesses or businesses that may not have the bigger balance sheets. And you just have to find those organizations again through relationships, but you have to perform. Like that's what this all comes down to, performance. You need to show them that, yeah, maybe my balance sheet is not as big as the other developers, but I can perform just as well. I have the resources. When I say resources, I don't just necessarily mean dollars. I have the staffing, I have the consultants that can get from A to B in a short period of time. You need to be able to do that. And then I think once you do that, with these institutions, then you have to say in their face, like, listen, I showed you I can make you money. I've showed you I made money on this deal. Let's work on financing my next deal and work on finance, make the next equity check or the equity slug a little bit larger because I've executed, right? So it's a little bit easier to hold the politicians accountable because they have to be reelected, but with private institutions, it's a matter of just being on point, being diligent, showing how you made money, and then hold them accountable to say let's work on the next deal. Let's work on a larger deal.
Nice. Nice. Yeah, it's a balance. I'm learning.
Yeah,
I keep referencing Donahue Peoples' quote of the crossroads of economics and is real estate development.
that's it. That's it.
It's so
Yeah,
real. But you're doing it at a high level, and I do appreciate you emphasizing, being part of trade organizations, such as NAREB, such as UDC, because you're stronger as a collective, right? They're gonna view you in a different light because you have more people with more resources and more capital, and you could do a bigger project together, and you could
right.
say, hey, as a collective, we believe that we need to be in a different direction.
Right. And not only that, there are opportunities, particularly with some organizations, where they have legislative days, like they have them up in Albany, right?
Mhm.
Go and testify. Go with your group, but you be the one that testifies. I've testified at a couple of events in City Hall, like that with the City Council, right? You have had the opportunity to advocate for your project or advocate for a certain type of housing or a certain kind of financing that would benefit you. You need to be the one testifying. You need to be the one. You need to be in their face. They need to see you and hear your voice. A lot of times, what I've learned in talking to, especially some state assembly folks, is that like, hey, we didn't know people like you existed. Like they didn't know there were black real estate developers or black real estate professionals who, when you create these new rules related to rent stabilization, they hurt people like us, right? But they were like, we didn't know you existed. Like we need to hear your voice more often. So that's part of it, right? But you just need to be in their faces. Right now, a lot of times, unfortunately, you get in their face, it costs you a donation, right? So that's the downside, right? And you listen, sometimes you just got to know when to say no. I have no problem saying no. Right? You should to say no sometimes, but at the same time, you sometimes you need these folks, and they need to hear your voice because they don't necessarily know, right? So you
Yeah,
just have to be in their faces.
and or for those that are just starting off or are, smaller developers, there's other ways in which you can provide support to an elected official or support to a private institution. I know that for me, I've been moving a lot of my social capital to help
Okay,
with that, my YouTube channel,
right,
my influence on LinkedIn, the relationships that I have in the community. So if you're if my brand is now associated with your brand, right, as an organization or an entity, then you have my stamp of approval, and that goes a long way. So it's the same as if you're just starting out, but you don't have the capital, but you don't have the financial capital, but you have social capital. You can leverage that too, but
that's right,
it's real estate, right? So it's all about negotiating and seeing how are they helping you at the same time. Helping you is helping your mission. What is your mission? And
that's right.
are you all aligned on that same mission and making it happen from there? So yeah, uh, again, more jewels being dropped. So I know we're getting really deep into the weeds of it, and I kind of want to make sure I don't overwhelm your time.
Okay,
So I
yep.
wanted to make sure that I just get these last few ones in. So I wanted to ask you, based on your knowledge and being able to see, the decades of changes, what are some emerging trends that you're seeing within the real estate development industry? There's been a lot of talk about modular, green tech, as even AI. I incorporate a lot of AI in the work that I do here for my business. And what do you believe will reshape real estate over the next 5 to 10 years?
So first I have to admit I'm like a dinosaur when it comes to AI, right? I'm just starting to use AI and I'm blown away. I'm like, man, I've been missing out on all these years and what this technology can do. I mean, even just simple as writing an email, right? I mean, it's a game changer. So now that I'm just finally really turning on or paying attention to what AI can do in this industry, I would love to see what AI does for the real estate industry and the real estate development space. One of the things I was saying, I'm not hugely involved with technology, but it seems like technology in the real estate development space lagged a little bit. I think it's a little bit behind other industries. I had a professor who had, and I, we had a couple of conversations about some technology that he was bringing along, right? So I think that's going to change. But I think now with AI, and especially now that I'm paying attention to it, I think we're probably going to see some rapid increase in the ability to get deals done, and particularly around modular development. So modular development it's been around for a while, but that's another one space I'm really paying close attention to. There's a develop. I'm doing a project right now in Newark, New Jersey, and it's two lots. One of the lots is already stick built, were built up, but the second lot we were just worked on the foundation. And my architect came back and said, "Hey, Ken, we could probably do a modular model here. A lot of this can be built off site. It'd save you money, but the savings we would some of it would have to go to the MVP, right? So we have to redesign the foundation. So it wasn't that big of a savings, but the savings would be in the time, right? The amount of time that it would take to instead of building the structure up, it's built in the factory, it comes, it's pre-built, and it's already up when you put it up. So I'm thinking about how modular, especially now with AI and the technologies they have, on how modular can impact the developments that I'm doing. I'm looking at, we sometimes, like I said, I mentioned doing, projects outside of my development. So I'm looking at buying this lot. It's a small little lot, put up a little 3-family home. But I'm thinking like, man, you know what? Maybe I could put up a modular home there, right? So instead of this project taking a year, maybe I could get this done in 9 months. I could get this bought, built, and sold in 9 months if I go the modular model, right? So I'm actually looking at that for this particular site. And I mean, if I do execute it, I'm going to execute on it as early as next week, right? So I'm in the weeds, like looking at these modular models, and I was talking to a sister who was like, oh, I work for this company, we do modular. So I'm going to actually want to reach out to her and be like, hey, what does this look like? You know, I'm thinking about building a 3-family home. I know someone who built a luxury home modular. And I saw it. I was like, wow. I didn't know what the possibilities were. But now with this new AI technology, and then just modular developers. See, what the reason I was a little hesitant with modular is because a couple of times the modular builders they would open up, do a couple of projects, and they would close down, right? So I was there, and that's because I guess the cycle of developers and moving into the modular space wasn't there yet, but now it's happening more and more often. It seems like most of these modular builders are out in Pennsylvania. I don't know why that is, but they're all in Pennsylvania now, it seems. But nonetheless, there are a few to choose from, and it looks like this modular model is going to be something that's going to impact our industry. Then you have companies like Boxable that's out in, I think they're in the Midwest or out in California, somewhere in the West. Their model, I think the company hasn't really made a profit yet, but if they could figure out what well, they've already kind of figured out the technology behind it, but if they could get that mass produced in various markets, it's already approved in I think 12 or 13 states. I think that's going to also be the kind of game changer in this industry. So yes, I'm paying attention. I'm paying attention to Boxable. I'm paying attention to modular, and I'm paying attention to what's happening with this AI stuff. And the other piece regarding green building, when you do affordable housing, you typically use enterprise green as your sustainability standard. But now I believe passive house, which is it's not necessarily that new, but you're starting to see be more common in multifamily housing in the United States. I think that's going to be the new enterprise green. That's going to become the standard. I work with a not-for-profit. I'm on the board of a not-for-profit, and they built, which right now is probably the biggest passive house development. It's about 30 some stories, 200 some apartments in the Bronx. And the development that we're working on is going to be passive house. The projects in the future are going to be passive house. So I think that's going to be the new standard also. So across the board, I'm looking at AI, what that's going to do for us. I'm looking at modular, and I'm kind of looking at how AI and modular are going to combine, and then paying attention to passive house standards for development in the future.
Yeah, and that's very much so what I'm at as well. Because in America it may be viewed as the future, but in other places around the world, Australia,
Standard.
Northern Europe,
Yeah.
China, that's just normal.
That's right.
That's what
Yeah.
it is. They're already doing that.
Yep.
So I'm glad to hear that someone like yourself is also interested. So I know I'm on the right path.
Yeah, that's why I say I think technology is a little bit behind here in the United States when it comes to development because they're doing it in European countries and they're doing it in Asia and they do all these other countries have been doing passive house. It's my understanding that passive house technology was actually created in the United States, according to the origins of it. And some folks say it's Germany, some folks say it's United States, but it was used in Germany quite often. That's where it was done on a larger scale before it came back to America. But like I said, I think now, particularly in the Northeast, where we have four seasons, I think we're going to see passive house be the standard here.
For sure. Well, I also want to, before we close out, do our rapid fire, the Better Living Fast Five, as we call it. So I got some quick questions that I wanted to ask you. Really not too much thought on it. Just hit us with your first thought of mine. So I'll
Okay.
start it off. What book changed your life?
So, there's really I don't think there's a book I can say that changed my life. There were books that I think helped me navigate the space that we're in. Right. So I'm gonna talk about and relates to real estate. There's a book called Skyscraper Dreams, right? And it's a book, and I think the author's name is Tom Chapman, but he talked about how families in Manhattan built up downtown Manhattan, right? The Empire State Building, the World Trade Center, built by the Port Authority, but how all these families, the Rockefeller Center, all these families built housing in Lower Manhattan. And what's striking, of course, is there were no black people mentioned because there was no black people who participated in any of it. But they talked about the gains, the losses, the pitfalls, the battles that owners were having. But for me being in real estate, I'm telling you, it was such an exciting read. I couldn't put the book down, right? You think they're talking about real estate, but I mean, if you love this, or eat, sleep, and drink this, like I do, I mean, it was a fantastic read. But then, as a black man, I remember being a teenager reading "Man, Child, and the Promised Land" by Claude Brown, right? And again, that's a book by Claude Brown is around the same age as my dad. He grew up in Harlem, same neighborhood as my dad, and I read his story about being a young man in the 1950s and 60s when my dad was the same age and what he went through to become a success. He ended up teaching at Howard University, writing a couple other books. But I remember that book just leaving an impact on me. I remember telling folks like, man, you have to read this book. This book was phenomenal. But part of it was probably because I was just so like I said, I always had that Harlem in my blood, right? So, anything about Harlem, I was fantasy, I would love to dig into. But that book just like that blew my mind. Man, China Promised Land and Skyscraper Dreams.
Got you. Got you.
Yeah.
What's one word your friend would use to describe you? Your friends, excuse me, would describe you
Friends.
as.
I would probably say loyal. I think I'm loyal. I'm deeply loyal to my friends. And friends is the word. I don't have a lot of friends. I have a lot of associates, but I don't have a lot of friends. So those who are my friends, folks I'm close to, I'm very loyal to them. So I would hope they would say that. I don't know what they would say, but maybe I guess they would say loyal and maybe thoughtful.
Nice.
Yeah.
Cash flow or appreciation, what gets you more excited?
Oh man, that's easy, man. Cash flow, brother. Cash flow. I can create appreciation with the cash flow. So give me the cash all the time, every time,
Urge
all
you.
day, every day.
Urge you. If not real estate, what career would you be in?
So, like I said, when I went to college, I definitely wanted to go into that computer systems or system analyst. Like I said, the degree I was going after was a computer-based information systems. So I think somewhere there, but outside of that, I would be an entrepreneur. Like I'm not a 9 to 5 dude. If I had to go get a job right now, I'd get fired in 2 weeks. Like I'm just so I'm just so used to doing my own thing and using my juices to be creative. So yeah, as opposed to saying computer systems, I'm just going to say being an entrepreneur, owning a business somewhere, owning businesses somewhere.
Understood. Understood. And what's your definition of living better?
Living healthy, having time, which I don't have for myself yet. I strive to get to that place where I have time for mental clarity and doing things that are beneficial to along a life. Meaning, exercise, recreation, reading. A lot of things that I have to force myself to do because just don't. I'm not there yet. So yeah, that's the definition to me. Like
Sure.
just being able to relax, but doing things that's going to extend your life.
Well, we appreciate
Those kind of
that.
activities. Yeah.
No, that. Hey, what they say, if you spend your time creating wealth, but you don't take care of your health, you're gonna use that wealth to put into your health. So health as well.
Health as well, right? What's the benefit of working so hard and getting all those resources and then being sick and you can't do nothing with it? I think about, I don't want to mention his name, but there was a black owner here in Harlem who, was a real estate broker, very well known, a very liked guy, owned this office building, sold it for millions of dollars and died 6 months later.
Mhm.
It's like,
Yeah.
I mean, I'm pretty sure his family benefited, but I'm just saying, like, I'm pretty sure his thought was, I worked so hard, I have these resources, and let me go live my life. So, that's a lesson. Like, you just have to live your life now because you never know when your number's going to be called.
Amen. Building for the future.
That's
And
right.
and with that being said, any closing remarks that you want to leave for our audience, with your wealth of knowledge and experience, something that a viewer that is looking to aspire to do the same work, if not, go to higher levels, that is younger out there, what would you say to them? What's your final thoughts on that?
Be willing to take a risk. You can't think it, and it's not going to happen because you think it's going to happen. It's not going to happen because you want it to happen. You have to make it happen, and you have to just take risks. I have a family member who knew nothing about media, but he bought a TV station, right? And he made it work, right? He had no fear in his mind. Like, when he told me what he was doing, the first thing I started thinking the reasons why he shouldn't do it. But all he thought about was why he should do it, right? So my point is, and I had to listen to myself. I'm like, man, I'm coming up with fears, my own fears, letting my own fears get in the way. And I've sometimes realized I probably could limit myself by thinking like that. But I've realized when we having this conversation, I'm like, oh wow, I'm doing exactly what I say don't do. And so what I'm suggesting to you is just be fearless. There are risks. Be willing to take a risk. I always talk about risk mitigation, but don't let risk mitigation be the reason why you don't do it. If you have a dream, you have a goal, go for it. You're the only person that can make it happen. And then the other thing is, find like-minded people. Be around people who are supportive. There are a lot of people in this space, a lot of people in this world, a lot of people that could be in your own circle, and they will pull from you. There are people, when you tell them what your goals are, or what your dreams are, they can't see that for themselves, so they really don't want it for you, and it prevents you from getting there. You always want to be around people who are way above where you are. Like, you want to always be striving up to folks. You don't always want to be you don't want to be the richest in the room. You don't want to be the most successful in the room. In my opinion, you want to be the least successful in the room. You want to have the lowest amount of funds in the room because everyone around you is at a different level and you're trying to get to that level. So be around people that can add to you, not people that's going to take away from you.
Amen. Amen. Well, we appreciate it. Thank you for blessing us with this knowledge and energy. Your leadership, man, it's a blueprint. It's a guide, no pun intended, because this is a real estate channel. But it's a blueprint not just for development, but for purposeful progress, right? So thank you again for the time. If you got value out of this conversation, please drop a comment below and let us know your favorite takeaway. Please follow Mr. Kenneth Morrison and learn more about Lemor Development, the United Developers Council, and NAREB as a whole, the NAREB chapter for Harlem as well, the NAREB board in Harlem. We're going to put all those links down in the comment section below and description. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this with someone working towards better living, just like yourself. Until next time, keep building, keep believing, and keep living better. Peace and progress.
Thank you, Paul.
Peace.